Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. We've got a good topic for you today. Let's do it. People of Reddit, what's the strangest or scariest thing you've ever encountered? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I tell this story every few years on Reddit, but when I was a little kid around 7, I was at the top of the Hoover Dam and some stranger winked at me, then jumped off. He bounced all the way down, screaming like crazy, until he hit a retaining wall at the bottom and exploded in a burst of gore. They put a fence in after that to stop jumpers. I have a distinct memory that the police or whoever had to drop a body bag from the top and have somebody catch it at the bottom. I was in the 5th grade on the bus, coming home, sitting with a friend, Las Vegas Boulevard in Las Vegas, when we heard blood-curdling screams. We looked out the window and a man had been hit by a car and his whole back was missing, exposing his ribs and muscles, and he just crawled toward the sidewalk. I'll never forget that image. Watching my then 3-year-old son tumble down our stairs in slow motion, knowing it wasn't fast enough and too far away to stop him. He's fine, but my heart effing stopped. Riding in the passenger seat of my coworker's friend as he drove us to work at 6:30 a.m., looking up and seeing the back of the pickup truck that just slowed down on the highway right before we rear-ended it and spun off the road, again being unable to stop or change things. Everyone wound up fine. Bruises were the worst for the people, but the vehicles were totaled. When I was 14, my parents went out to dinner with friends and left me home alone. There was a very soft knocking at the door, but I couldn't see anyone through the window. A minute later, there was more knocking. This went on for 20 minutes. My parents got home and I told them. It was snowing, and they said it must have been the wind. I opened the door, and there was a set of small footprints, about a woman size 6. The creepiest part were the footsteps approached the door, then wandered to the side like she'd climbed the bushes under the window and looked inside before wandering off. It was a while before I wanted to be home alone again. A month after I moved into my apartment, I was woken up at 4 a.m. by over a dozen gunshots outside my window. Guess there was a drive-by. I cracked my blinds and there was just this guy laid out in the street in an ever-expanding pool of blood. Then the authorities showed up, and did the now-deceased man's wife, and watching her pound on the back doors of the ambulance after they put him in, body covered, is an image I'll never get out of my head. I was on a higher floor, and her screams and wails penetrated my closed windows. Didn't sleep again that night. When I was about 17, I was helping a friend, and on my way home, it was just starting to get dark out. When making my way out of his neighborhood, I turned down a one-way street with some houses and lots of trees. I came across a mom, dad, and young daughter standing side by side equal distance across the road. My headlights were on, so I slowed down, hoping they would see the light and move out of the way. Instead, they slowly and simultaneously turned around and stared me down with emotionless expressions and didn't move. I'm sure there's some rational explanation, but with the lighting perfectly eerie, my heart just stopped. So I put my car into reverse and noped the F out of there as they remained perfectly still until they were out of view. Yeah, I'd probably do the same thing. Sounds really creepy. Not me, but my parents. Context. After my uncle died, my grandmother fell into a deep depression. She would barely leave her house and couldn't move on, so my dad would usually call her every Monday as a health check. He made it a routine, and he rarely missed a day. My family was celebrating the 4th of July when my dad realized he forgot to call my grandma last Monday. He went inside and tried to call her. No answer. He tried again. No answer. Left a voicemail. No call back. My parents decided to drive out to her house to see if she was okay. They asked me if I wanted to go. To this day, I'm glad I denied their request. My parents arrived to her apartment. They knocked on the door. No answer. After unlocking the door, they ran inside. They found her lying on the ground, not moving. After calling 911, they found out that she had died of suicide and left a singular note: "Do not revive me." Not really on par with the severity of some of the other comments here, but I watched a pigeon walk into traffic and get hit by a car, and I've never been able to get it out of my head. They flew down onto a semi-busy, super long and straight stretch of road. Speed limit was like 60 kilometers per hour. I was watching from across a train platform. There was a gap in the traffic at the time, and I assumed the bird would see the oncoming traffic and move, but they didn't acknowledge it. The traffic came closer and closer. It was like watching in slow motion. I kept waiting for them to move until a passing car finally impacted the bird and their bodies splattered absolutely everywhere. Feathers decorated the road along with so much blood. I'm still utterly baffled at why they didn't move. The road was 3 lanes wide, and there was plenty of space and time to get out of the way. They even flew down from where they were roosting above the road previously. I honestly can't even begin to imagine why it happened, and it's bothered me for the last couple of years. I grew up in a rough neighborhood as a poor kid. I've definitely seen some shit: drive-by shootings, attempted kidnappings in kindergarten, so much abuse experienced by my fellow childhood neighbors, etc., but this just disturbed me. When I was in high school, I lived just down the road from where the train tracks went through our town. Me and one of my best friends walked it every morning. One morning, he didn't come. I just thought he was taking the day off since he did a lot. That was until I saw him off to the side of the tracks on my way to school. That's an image I'll never get out of my head. This is a bit of a tie for me. 1. I was driving to an event on the freeway with some friends. I saw a man on the center divide running. He jumps over the cement dividers and tries to bolt across a 3-lane freeway. Doesn't even make it halfway, the first lane, and gets hit by an SUV and literally flips through the air. I had to pull over and actually cried. 2. Many years later, a week after taking CPR classes, a neighbor showed up at my apartment and asked me to help lift her husband as he had fallen onto the back patio. I'm a big guy and try to be friendly with my neighbors. I arrive, and he wasn't in the death rattle, or whatever you want to call it. Barely breathing, blank stare, sudden gasps. I had to do CPR for the first time, and I was terrified. He did not live. I don't blame myself, nor did the wife. He was nearing the end, apparently. It took me about 5 days to recover enough mentally, and thankfully, since it was during COVID, I had 2 weeks to work from home, and that gave me some extra recovery time. I was on a ferry in the Mediterranean sailing from Athens to the Aegean Islands. We passed a bare, rocky island that was perhaps 100 yards in length and entirely barren apart from a solitary man dressed in the dark apparel of an Orthodox priest. He was standing motionless and facing away from us. I was curious as to why this priest was standing alone on an otherwise deserted island, so I called to my Greek friend who was standing on the other side of the deck. He approached, and just as I was about to point to the lonely figure, I saw that he had disappeared. I tried to explain what I saw, but my Greek friend said it was impossible. The island was uninhabited, and there was no sign of any boat nearby. I never got an explanation for that one. Working in a small convenience store in the middle of a town as security, it was about 3 a.m., and I hear a commotion in the shop. I go in, and it's a drunk dude arguing with one of the staff. I intervene and force the drunk out, argue at the store entrance, and pulls a knife. Not wanting to show weakness, I stare at him and say, "Try it, dickhead." We stare for what seems like hours before he runs off. The staff are amazed, and I act like I wasn't fazed, but my heart was nearly beating out of my chest, and I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. When I was in 6th grade, I lived in Pennsylvania, and one day we had off school because it had snowed like 6 inches. My best friend and I decided we were going to go door to door to offer shovel people's driveways in exchange for cash. As a 6th grader with nothing better to do on a snowy day, we geared up and got our shovels from the garage and headed down the cold, wintry road toward the first house. After about an hour of going door to door, we came across one house in particular that was tucked away down a long driveway. As my friend and I approached the front door, I told him I was going to take a quick peek around the corner of the house to see if their car was in the detached garage behind the house. Once I realized the homeowners must have been home, since there were no tire tracks on the driveway indicating they had left, I ran back up to the front door to meet up with my friend. When I got back to him, standing at the front door, the look on his face was one of pure terror. He didn't answer me when I asked if he had knocked or if anyone had answered. He just said, "I'm leaving," with his eyes fixated on something through the window. As he was saying this, I looked inside through a small window in between the door and the doorbell. There was a table inside with a white cloth covering it. Underneath the cloth was the outline of a body. You could very clearly see that someone was laying under it. Before I could process what I was looking at, my friend had taken off down the driveway. I turned so effing fast, and we both ran all the way back to his house. We were freaked the F out and told his mom, but she just laughed and said it was probably nothing. We told her to call the cops, but she didn't believe us. But we knew what we saw. I'm still trying to understand the concept of parents blowing off their children's concerns. I mean, if my son or daughter came up to me and said, "Dad, there's a gorilla in the tree on Long Island," I'd be like, probably not. But I'm gonna look, right? I don't know. Listen to your kids. Sometimes. All the time. I, female, was out walking in the woods alone in my early 20s, bow hunting in an area I was very familiar with. It was getting dark, so I was heading back to camp. I heard a strange bird whistle and thought that's weird. Kept walking up the trail and kept hearing it. The closer I got, the less it sounded like a bird and the more it sounded like a human whistle. I realized I was going to have to walk right by it. Our camp had a lot of people, but I knew none of them would mess with me that way because I had also a sidearm on me. Mountain lions and bears. I ended up jacking the side, which is fairly distinct sound, as a kind of warning, and walked with my head on a swivel the rest of the way to the camp. When I got home, I looked up everything I could to convince myself it wasn't some creep. Years later, my husband walked in the house whistling, and every hair on my body raised up. I asked him what he was whistling. He said it was the song from Jeepers Creepers. Not firsthand, but through a video. A lady with a plastic bag on the end of a stick. She had lit the bag on fire and was dripping the molten plastic onto her children's hands and arms. They would wince and try to pick off the plastic as it seared their skin. This video surely isn't the most scary thing possible, but it's about one of the most horrific things I've personally had to witness happen. It really effed with me, knowing those kids were likely being punished for innocent things by some evil, malevolent. From what I've heard about, Unit 731 in Japan did some pretty effing unspeakable experiments, all sorts of tortures and deaths by various means. This data was eventually brought by the people like the US and Russians in a willingness to not make things public. They traded the experimental knowledge for leniency, basically. That's pretty scary to know that. Many psychopaths were likely involved, and they probably had very little guilt or remorse for the killings of everyone who came into that unit or facility. Sleep paralysis. Only experienced it once, which makes it even more odd in my mind. I was visiting my parents in upstate New York, and I had a dream that the house was on fire. I awoke to full paralysis, then seeing a humanoid figure in the corner of the room. After doing research, many people see similar images of some kind of entity in the room with them when they experience sleep paralysis. Still weirds me out to this day. Hasn't happened since. 7 years old and had a favorite uncle, coolest dude in the world. Hung out all the time, going to get parts for his truck, the record store, etc. Actually, the reason I'm still a huge Iron Maiden fan. Grandma calls one day screaming and crying so loud I could hear her. It was just me and my dad, so we hauled ass. We walked in the front door to see him sitting there with half a head, shotgun in the mouth, over a girlfriend. It was 40 years ago, and I can still see it. Getting stabbed in the chest and wrestling with the guy on top of me on the ground. Then, while our faces were so close, almost touching each other, his head exploded. It took me a moment to register that 2 loud bangs had been gunshots fired at him to get him off of me by another. Wiping his blood and brains off my face later was horrific, but the thought that those bullets could just as easily hit me was more scary. Yeah, I mean, did you know the person who shot your attacker? I mean, very dangerous situation. There are a lot of wrongs and rights and a lot of context missing, but whoa. Ghost story, long but worth it. When I was 6, I was absolutely terrified for no reason at all to sleep in my bedroom by myself. I remember like it was yesterday, crying and begging my parents, please let me sleep in my brother's room, please. My parents were trying to watch TV. My mom very begrudgingly said, fine, you can tonight, but tomorrow you're back in your own room, period. I was filled with intense relief. I knew I would be safe with my brother. For context, my mom never, ever let us watch scary movies, ever. There was nothing specifically I was afraid of, but I was terrified to sleep in my room that night. My mom made up a blanket pallet on the floor of my brother's room. I was right next to his twin bed. I'm laying on my back, eyes open. I hear my brother drifting off. I'm laying there basking in my wind feeling, so glad I didn't have to sleep in my room. All of a sudden, at the base of my bedding, a man is standing looking down at me. Our eyes are locked. He's in color, not like a see-through mist. He has on a red one-piece long john pajama. He's white, with a brown beard neatly trimmed, looks no more than 25. If I had to describe him, I would say he looked like Seth Green with a beard, but very, very serious. He stands there, staring down at me. I'm absolutely frozen with fear. I whisper my brother's name, eyes locked with the man. Nothing. I say it louder. Louder still. My brother doesn't stir. Finally, I risk looking away to grab my brother's hand that was hanging over the bed to wake him. In the split second it took to find my brother's hand, the man disappeared. After that night, I was weirdly never afraid again. I didn't tell my mom about this until I was an adult. I was never afraid in that house again. Well, Reddit, it gets even weirder and more far-fetched. 10 years later, I'm in high school across town, probably moved in and out of 5 houses since that house when I was 6. My friend had said he and his family moved into a house recently. Remember, across town, totally different school district. He said the street name, and I jokingly said the address and said, I used to live in that street in XYZ house. Wouldn't that be funny if you lived there? Well, he did live there. That same week, I give him a ride home. I newly had my permit, he didn't, and confirmed yes, that was my childhood home. We go inside for a quick tour, and he's in my brother's old room. Weeks pass. One day, this friend, very big football player guy, tough, is sitting next to me in class, very quiet and pale. He says to me in a nervous, jokey way, hey, when you lived in my house, did you ever see anything weird? He said it in a way like he didn't really want to know the answer, like he was nervous, trying to talk himself out of something. I said without hesitation, yes, I saw a ghost when I was a little girl in your room, but I was never afraid again after I saw him. I recount what I said above. He went ash gray. Smile slips off his face. He then tells me that the morning he was laying in bed and he had woken up, and he knew his alarm would go off soon, so he laid there on his side, bed against the wall, facing the room, with his eyes closed, enjoying the last few seconds of peace. He says he had a strange feeling, so he opened his eyes. In front of his bed, kneeling at eye level, was a woman inches away from his face, staring at him. She immediately disappeared. His alarm went off seconds later. He was very shaken up. I tried to make him feel better by telling him my ghost never bothered me again, and I felt better after having seen it. This is by far the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. The fact I was unexplainably terrified as a child, but then after seeing a ghost man staring me down, I was no longer afraid. The fact that 10 years later I move across town to a completely different school district, and one of my few friends just happens to move into my childhood home and the same bedroom, and then he just happens to ask me in a scared, nervous way if I ever saw anything weird, and then lo and behold, he sees a ghost in the same room. TLDR. I see a ghost in my childhood home. My high school friend astoundingly moves into the same house and the same room and sees a different ghost.